Hello, Dylan here. Just before we jump into this episode, I just wanted to say this episode was recorded in a pub. As such, there is some external noise. I've done my best to get rid of it all, but the quality of the audio isn't quite as high as it normally is. Do not adjust your sets. Welcome back to Too Hot for TV. We're the podcast that looks at all things extended universe. Today, I'm joined by, for the first time on this version of the podcast, Artfully Liam. Liam, welcome.
Good afternoon to the audio listeners of the general Too Hot for Time TV Annex. It's a wonder, it's a delight to be here. I apologise for anything that I'm probably going to say in the next 90 minutes, which puts you off humanity, but it's really a delight to be here.
So today we're going to be looking at the expanded universe, the expanded media of Millennium. Millennium was an American television series created by Chris Carter of the X-Files fame, which aired on Fox from October 25th, 1996 to May 21st, 1999. The series follows the investigations of ex-FBI agent Frank Black, played by Lance Henriksen, now a consultant with the ability to see inside the minds of criminals, working for a mysterious organization known as the Millennium Group. So, presumably, you're a big Millennium fan, or you wouldn't be here.
Well, yeah, absolutely. As much as your tasting coffee and scampi fries is anything to draw even the most ardent of Millennium fans in, I love this. This is my jam. And I thought to myself, who better to probe the niche dark corners of a once forgotten and terribly underrated television series than the corridors of Too Hot for TV. So it seemed the perfect marriage.
Excellent. Well, look, I'm glad that we've had to jump into it. But before we jumped into it, I had to jump into the show itself because it was something I was aware of. So I think I've definitely seen the pilot before.
Okay.
Back in my murky youth, I used to go to like a local group, a meet-up of fans,
Right.
and we'd gather in a function room above a pub. They'd show us like rare treats, and inevitably at the time, a lot of that was stuff that was on in America that wouldn't reach the UK for 6 months to a year.
That it's like probably 8 months before we got to see the story.
So I'm pretty sure as a 12-year-old, and I think it was the strip club moments right at the beginning that stirred a memory from 12-year-old.
We've all been stirred. Chris Carter, we love you.
So I had to jump in and watch some choice episodes to just sort of get a feel for the universe of it before I looked at anything beyond the TV show. But presumably you've seen it all, love it all.
I've seen it all. Yeah, I mean, what can I say about Millennium? We'll get into it, but I understand your perspective completely, because Millennium is effectively here from the distance of 30 years on in 2026, is practically a forgotten kind of corner and annex of the American television landscape. And it's amazing to me that it is, because it's such a progenitor in many ways of a lot of modern television. Things like Breaking Bad, David Fincher's Mindhunter, Ryan Murphy's American Horror Story, that sort of visceral kind of take on serial killers and supernatural and the occult and procedural television, even the way down to Jerry Bruckheimer's CSI franchise of Mark Tipper. There's so much that's an antecedent of today's television in Millennium.
Yeah.
And it's such a crying damn shame that it's not readily available for people like yourself. The box sets on DVD are extortionately expensive on the bay that is referred to as Ernest. You can't get it on Blu-ray. It's never been released on Blu-ray. Due to a load of issues, which I'm sure we'll get into later, it's never been put on streaming.
Right.
Not for want of trying by various parties adjacent to the franchise. It is a tremendously forgotten television series. And for me, that's not only part of its tragedy, but part of its allure, because it seems like you have to really big this out. But if you do, my God, it's rewarding.
Yeah. I mean, it is that era of television. Like, I think if you're a sci-fi fan who grew up in that era, whether you watched it or not, you'll have some memory of it being around, being talked about in the genre press. But to, the average person, not we, they will have no memory of it whatsoever because it was on in the UK probably once or twice and then it was gone.
I generally introduce it in conversation when I talk to people about it, as I'd say, everybody is aware of the X-Files. Everybody loves the X-Files.
Yeah.
It stirs a memory for a particular kind of generation. It was seminal. I think people underestimate how much Chris Carter 1013 production has changed the television landscape in the early 1990s. And a lot of that was due to the fact that as we approach the millennium, ironically enough, there's very much a human instinct for closure and a desire for revelation and kind of context. There was a lot of unanswered questions and people kind of started to look heavenly, skywards for revelation and answers. And so that vogue for mysteries and myths and folklore, it came around again. And unlike its sister show, Millennium, a lot of the X-Files' potent success, in my opinion, was that it married that classic folklore, the classic supernatural tales, with a very post-moonlighting, will they, won't they, relationship between the two leads. Millennium didn't have that. Millennium is a lot more mature in many ways. It's a lot more measured. It's a lot more methodical in its approach. And whereas it has trappings of procedural crime investigative television, the creative latitude that was afforded to Chris Carter post the success in the X-Files meant that this was released onto an unsuspecting public, including myself as a young man in the early 1990s. And I think it shows a sort of creative frisson that he was allowed scope and a breadth and a depth to develop ideas that I don't think, honestly, Dylan, I don't think you would be allowed that freedom in television today.
No, but also, like, if he'd have pitched Millennium before the X-Files, I don't think he would have got away with it.
No way. No way.
It's such a darker version of the Chris Carter universe that I don't think anybody would have picked it up. It's only because the X-Files took episodes and seasons to go to those places that they proved it sort of could work.
It's very much, and Chris has said on record that he was very much influenced by David Fincher's 1995 seminal movie Seven.
Yeah, there's a lot of that, especially in that first episode.
It's just, I think that they actually hired the assistant DOP, the director of photography, for that pilot. It's astonishing. The palette is so grainy and rain-soaked. But it is, again, it's astonishing. I don't think it would have been allowed on television prior to the X-Files. And I think that even a few years post its release, I don't think Chris Carter's name had the heavyweight influence in television circles that it did when the X-Files was at its zenith.
Yeah.
And so for me, there's something very pure and very artistic about Millennium, is that it seems to be immediately tapping into something that Chris was preoccupied with telling. And at least in its early stages, there's very little genre traffic in it.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
But we'll get into it.
Yeah. Hot for TV. So the first thing we're going to look at today is Millennium, a 5-issue comic book series published by IDW from January to August of 2015, based on the TV series of the same name, obviously. The series was written by Joe Harris with artwork by Colin Lorimer. IDW is a name I'm familiar with, but I wanted to have a look at what IDW were doing in 2015. Yeah. And they are very much they do a lot of original titles, but they are very much the place to go if you have a franchise that has an expanded universe worth exploring. So a couple of titles that they had going for them at the time included Airwolf, Andre the Giant, Batman and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Edward Scissorhands, The Fly, Ghostbusters, Judge Dredd, Miami Vice, Orphan Black, Star Trek, multiple iterations of Star Trek, Transformers, and the X-Files. So some of those started life as comics, some of them sprawled out into television, into films, but ultimately there is a spin-off world for all of those things that exists and has a home at IDW, which I think is fucking brilliant.
It's amazing. And again, the landscape there, we're looking at 2015, 2014, and a lot of these, we're far enough away from that kind of fantasy sci-fi cult boom of the late 1990s.
Yeah.
That a lot of these properties have been dormant for several years. And as we've seen in multiple fandoms, namely the Time Lord that we shall not mention, nostalgia is a hell of a drug.
Yeah.
And it had moved far enough away from these properties to become commercially viable.
Yeah.
And for people's memories to be so rose-tinted. And yeah, you touched on it briefly there. Joe Harris had enjoyed tremendous success with relaunching The X-Files, season 10 of The X-Files, which is presented as a 26 comic issue series in the vein of a novel series following on from the cancellation of the original run.
Yeah.
This was prior to the revival coming back with Chris Carters in 2016. So to all intents and purposes at this time, this was the original continuation of the original Adventures of Mulder and Scully.
Yeah.
And it's the success of that that allows, I believe, IDW and Joe Harris to go off licenses in the 1013 universe, such as Millennium.
Yeah.
Because it was convinced even a short would be financially violated.
Absolutely.
Set 15 years after the Millennium event was supposedly averted, Millennium follows former FBI profiler Frank Black as he's drawn back into the orbit of the mysterious Millennium Group. Frank has tried to distance himself from the darkness that once consumed his life, but a string of unsettling events, including the release and death of a serial killer connected to the group, forces him to investigate again. Along the way, he reunites with FBI agent Fox Mulder, who becomes entangled in a growing conspiracy involving demonic forces, hidden cult activity, and signs that the apocalypse may never truly have been prevented. As Frank pursues the resurging Millennium Group, he discovers his estranged daughter Jordan has become deeply involved with the organisation and has inherited psychic abilities similar to his own. Their investigation leads them from Washington, D.C. to Seattle, where supernatural manifestations intensify and the demonic entity, Lucy Butler, re-emerges as a central threat. Frank, Mulder and Jordan are ultimately forced into a confrontation with both the group and the forces manipulating it, culminating in a battle over Jordan's powers and humanity's future. Although the immediate danger is contained, the story ends with the suggestion that the struggle between human evil and supernatural darkness is far from over.
So, does comics feel like the natural place for the series to go at this point?
It's a strange one. Millennium is very much a visual show, even down to the it was so innovative in small dramatic flourishes and things that it elaborated like Frank Black's visions of seeing inside the mind of the killer.
Yeah.
And those are presented, and bear in mind, we're talking late 1990s television, as very fast-cut, hallucinatory, trippy, LSD sort of interjections into the narrative with high-pitched kind of off-verbal intonations. Seeing that translated to the printed page is very much a thought at the time and natural extrapolation of that. Harris and Lorimer do some wonderful things with it. They tend to soak individual large panels. It's very much red and bold imagery, bold colours, as opposed to the procedural traits, which are very much soaked in the monochromatic kind of palette of the show. So, yeah, I think that they really make the use of the media as it was presented to them to the show's benefit.
Mm-hmm. And why did they wait so long before jumping back into the universe? Well, the character had appeared elsewhere beforehand.
So, I mean, I touched on it briefly. So, Joe Harris had enjoyed tremendous success with The X-Files season 10. And midway through that year, a 2-part cutaway issue story, so bear in mind with 16 pages per issue, 16 pages, two issues is pretty much equivalent to about a 42-minute episode on television.
Right.
And they done a one-shot across 2 issues called Immaculate, which was about where Mulder and Scully investigate the mysterious woman of an abortion.
Right.
And discover that there is more supernatural and folklore that's not at play that they might immediately assume. And that the cold open of second issue features the return of our favourite criminal profiler, FBI agent Frank Black, as played by Lance Henriksen. And he's reintroduced in a wonderful way. Lorimer was carried over with Joe Harris from the X-Files season 10 to the Millennium 5 issue. And him reintroduction of Frank is wonderful. I can see it in my mind's eye where emotion they're talking about building all the same, well, they need somebody with special expertise in this. And then you see a full panel of the reintroduction of Frank, head and shoulders portrait. And instead of having the actual titles that you would have for television, they just have a single bar at the end of the page with the X-Files logo. Funnily enough, in the Millennium version of that, we have a similar thing with the Ouroboros snake.
Yeah.
Which, as listeners who may want to delve into the live or extended world, would realize is actually the symbol of the Millennium Group and itself. An instrumental thing in the denouement of this story.
Yeah.
So, yeah, making great visual use of the medium.
And X-Files and Millennium have history, right?
They do. I mean, Chris Carter was actually very vocal when he launched Millennium in October 1996 that he didn't want it to be. And this is pre-Marvel Cinematic Universe. This is pre-kind of crossover pollination of the Arrowverse. He didn't want it. He emphatically rejected it. He did not want a shared universe. He wanted Millennium to be its own show. At least in the beginning, he wanted it to be almost devoid of supernatural elements. There are some questions you yourself have seen in the pilot about whether Frank's gift is psychic in nature or just some tremendous criminal insight.
Yeah.
That evolves over the course of the 3 seasons. But Chris very much wanted Millennium to be on its own. He wanted it to be almost a straight show. And as the series developed and a multitude of factors, shall we say, the involvement of the network, a desire to marry horse with its sister show, let's even say perhaps, ratings that were falling beyond what Fox expected beyond that initial pilot. Forced them, they very slowly introduced the X-Files universe into Millennium. There's a first season episode called Lamentation, which is a seminal running show, which features a wonderful tiny scene where Frank Black passes 2 very familiar looking FBI agents on the staircase, one with fiery red hair and one with a laconic deadpan smile, which were actually played by David Duchovny and Gillian Anderson.
Nice.
So, but then that evolves, and in the second season, one of the X-Files is most infamous for one of the reasons, writer, a guy called Darren Morgan, who did these wonderful kind of irreverent satires on the industry, the format. He wrote an episode called Jose John's Doomsday Defense, which is a very thinly veiled parody of many things, chiefly amongst them the Church of Scientology. But it's a tremendous episode. It's one of Millennium's best. But the character of Jose John himself was originally born in that episode with the extra.
Right, okay.
So his appearance in Millennium totally works with the product and comes up with one of the most famous phrases of Millennium, which is where he turns sternly to Lance Henriksen and says, "Don't be dark, Frank." A phrase we can all learn from.
So, how does this comic pick up from the end of the series?
So Millennium ended rather ignominiously and cruelly before the actual turn of the real Millennium. It ended in May 1999. There is a larger story to this. Ironically, the season was primarily cancelled due to the intervention of Chris Carter.
Really?
Chris Carter wanted to launch his new product, his new baby, in the fall of that year in a changing Fox network that wanted a slightly more lighter, fluffier lineup, especially that on a Friday night, which is where Millennium and the X-Files before. He wanted to launch an adaptation of a property called Harsh Rel.
Okay.
With the wonderful Millennium alumni went on to do Lost to play John Locke, Terry O'Quinn. And he wanted to launch that as his new baby, as his new product.
Yeah.
He was really excited about this, and co-executive producer Frank Scotland. Unfortunately, they got to a point where they thought they wanted to shove all of their eggs in the basket of that, and it became necessary for them. Of course, they didn't really want to dilute their time as they had been when Millennium had originally launched, and they were basically involved in the part cancellation of Millennium.
Right.
And I think if you watch the last few episodes of season 3, you can see certainly thematically the writing was on the wall there. it is a tremendous shame because I think that executive producer, Chip Johansson, who worked on season 3, was actually gearing towards what would have been a great conclusion for a final year of the show. But to spin it back to your original question, Frank's journey ends in the last episode of season 3, entitled Goodbye to All That, where he discovers that his former employers in the Millennium Group were at least partly involved in attempting to embark upon an apocalypse of their own creation.
Right.
And marrying the two narrative strands forward of the show, i.e. the apocalyptic predilections of the Millennium Group and the investigation of serial killers, it's revealed that the Millennium Group is in part trying to manufacture serial killers to legitimize their own political existence in the FBI, and so that they can function and move towards their own goal. Frank is understandably horrified with it, and takes his daughter out of school, his 8-9-year-old daughter, and they effectively go on the run as fugitives to a new life together. The final shot of the series is Frank's Cherokee red Jeep spinning off in the distance over a sunset hill towards a new and uncertain future. Much unlike the ending of Doctor Who in 1989, where Sylvester McCoy wandered over the hill.
But so here, him and his daughter are long estranged, although ultimately she does show up.
Yeah.
So it's moved the character on, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And we pick up some 14, 15 years on in real time. Frank Black is now estranged from his daughter, who at least in part blames him and the Millennium Group, which is an interesting thing, but we shall come to that, for the death of their late mother, Catherine, who actually died the conclusion of the second season of Millennium. And she blames Frank, at least in huge part, for the death of her mother and for the events that unfolded over the course of the 3-year-long series. That estrangement and the dynamics that are played out for that are a huge part of Harris's 5-part series. It's interesting because Millennium, for as much as it investigates serial killers, supernatural, apocalyptic prophecy, and various fringe of camera associated with that, Millennium is effectively a very different show through each of its 3 seasons.
Right.
And that is primarily due to the fact of production issues beyond its control during the first season. And this is incredible when you consider that Russell T. Davies and Bad Wolf have trouble banging out 8 episodes a year of Doctor Who. But in that first year of Millennium, Dylan, to give the listeners some context, 1013 Productions produced 22 episodes of Millennium, 24 episodes of The X-Files, and a 2.5-hour feature film, X-Files Fight the Future. That's in one production year. You yourself work in television production. I can only imagine you from a production standpoint, as you can imagine what was being produced at that year.
It's wild. It's different times.
That's astonishing. They almost had a creative breakdown.
Right.
So at the end of the first season, Chris Carter enlisted his long-term producer associates, Glenn Morgan and James Wan, to take over the reins of the show. Millennium then enjoyed a 23-episode second season at their helm, which became a lot more creative by the apocalypse of prophecy. Morgan and Wan departed the show at the end of the second season, which ended with a worldwide plague, claiming the results of huge amounts of the world population, a burst of static, and apocalyptic distress calls. Now that, you may think, Dylan, could be a series finale, but you'd be fucking wrong. Because Fox, against all the odds, commissioned it for a 3rd and final year and wanted it to be built on its more of a procedure, which is a bit difficult when you've decimated half the world's population. So Millennium then reinvents itself to hybrid of the 2 in the 3rd year, becoming a weird mixture of FBI procedural, as Fred goes back to work for the FBI, and a general reintroduction of slightly opaque and elliptic delivery. Why do I mention this when talking about the real? Well, poor old Joe Harris in 2015 had to effectively marry 3 different versions of the same form, cohesively wrap them up in a whole new story, make it attractive enough for casual viewers that were related by the X-Files comic, and bring a whole new audience in. And to be honest with you, I think he does the best fucking job that he could have done, because it is a marriage of all 3 different versions of Millennium. And it also gets X-Files, our fans, on board, because, for lack of a better term, Frank Black's companion for this 5-episode miniseries is none other than Special Agent Fox Mulder and David Duchovny.
Yeah. So how does he fit into it?
Well, I've just talked about making things open and making things transparent. Millennium, the miniseries, opens with Special Agent Fox Mulder, the parole hearing of one serial killer called Monty Cross.
Right.
And now, Monty Cross was featured in the original run of The X-Files in one line of dialogue in the pilot episode,
Right.
where they mentioned casually in Scully's introduction scene that Mulder was responsible for getting Monty Cross set down in 1988 as a result of his heinous multiple murders.
Yeah.
It's a throwaway line of dialogue. It's one line of dialogue which Joe Harris extrapolates to launch an entire new spin-off version of a spin-off show that was never intended to be connected to the X-Files universe.
Yeah.
That's one hell of a tangential fucking late start,
I'm here for it.
but it works.
Yeah.
Mulder is at Fox's hearing. Strangely enough, they're all on board thinking of a FBI agent turning up talking about apocalyptic prophecy, serial killer imagery, and a man whose fringe preoccupation is looking for little green men and hunting his abducted sister. Not really thinking that this man is the primary force of trusted lodger to be recommended on. Monty Cross walks free. And that is where Special Agent Frank Black comes into the story.
And do they make a good team?
Yeah, it's amazing because Frank Black is a very different, and Joe Harris captures Lance Henriksen's taking that out to know. Frank Black is a very different character to Mulder Scully. The Mulder Scully Duchovny Anderson dynamic is a huge part of why the X-Files success.
Yeah.
The X-Files has got a huge fan base, which is very diverse. But there's a huge part of that fan base that are shippers that just wanted Mulder and Scully to get it on.
Well, that was the mainstream appeal of it, wasn't it?
Absolutely. It was the Sybil Shepherd, Bruce Willis moonlight dynamic in Force Again. It's part of the reason why the show succeeded. Frank Black is a very different character. He's much more subdued. He's much more melancholic by necessity. Coming into a miniseries in 2015, you're dealing with a man who's left the FBI, had a nervous breakdown, been estranged from his daughter, lost his wife to a plague, realized his former employers were in charge of orchestrating a plague that wiped out what it turns out was just a large part of the Seattle outbreak, but originally you'd think it was the main world.
Yeah.
And was single-handedly responsible for trying to engineer a apocalyptic end times. Naturally, he's not in the best mental state of mind when this scene launches. So Mulder is a great counterfoil to Frank's kind of slightly dour and laconic delivery.
Yeah.
And they make a great team. You can actually hear Duchovny and Henriksen's kind of delivery.
Yeah. And what do you think about how Frank Black is handled in this?
I think that when you consider the in-universe evolution, it's actually a very probably accurate extrapolation of where Frank was towards the end of season 3. Well, Lance Henriksen has gone on record saying he always liked the original Chris Carter portrayal of Frank Black. This is very cool, calm, and detached. So you're almost looking at one of these kind of Sergio Leone-esque kind of gunfire that rides into town, solves salty issues, and leaves again, the mysterious man in black. By its very necessity, the in-universe evolution of Frank Beach really do that by the end of the third season.
Yeah.
And I think what Carter, Johansson, and Ken Borden, producers on the show in that last year, did was marry the two visions together in a way that Henriksen found it much more happy and clear to play. And actually, he developed his own sidekick in that last year. The wonderful Claire Scott, who played FBI agent Emma Hollis, who effectively is Frank's. It's a weird hybrid of Dana Scully and almost a protege. So while it's devoid of that sexual tension, it's very, very much more engrossing for me in that Emma Hollis almost takes his surrogate daughter role. So watching how Frank evolves in this 5-issue miniseries and deals with the estrangement from Jordan, his daughter, is one of the primary motivations and motives of this story. In many ways equal to the supernatural threat that unfolds from Monty Cross.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the key successes that Harris takes. He's taken that father-daughter relationship and anchored it and made it the heart of the story. And that is what makes it relatable to people who, like yourself, might not necessarily be versed in apocalyptic end time.
The story is an interesting one, isn't it? Because it's It doesn't feel, at least to me, like it's trying to set up, we're going to just continue this forever and ever in a
It
comic.
feels like
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it works on a base level of like, this is an interesting enough story if you don't know the series in and out. But I guess there's probably more mythology there that I'm not aware of.
absolutely. And I think what Harris did, and there are some wonderful little nods in there that, you know, even you might not be aware of. So, as I mentioned, touched upon earlier, Chris Carters was initially very resistant about making it shared universe with the X-Files. So by the end of the second season, Margaret and Watt have got, you know, Frank Trapp, sometime ally, sometimes foe, Millennium Group member Peter Watt, discovering a discarded packet of Morley cigarettes, the brand favoured by the famous cigarette smoking man.
Of course.
Nods. Harris continues that in this miniseries. There is a number of scenes where you see the shadowy machinations of the Millennium Group itself through for a shadowy cult that really don't want to draw attention to themselves. It's somewhat interesting that they have a lot of their meetings in an opaque, very grand ballroom with a large fucking Ouroboros on the table. But this is comics, it's imagery, it works as iconography. But there is a wonderful scene there where, contemporaneous to this 5-issue miniseries, we said before that the X-Files season 10 was running.
Yeah.
And the main antagonist of that X-Files miniseries was one of Mulder and Scully's former allies, the child chess prodigy, Gibson Praise.
Right.
And Gibson Praise is only noticeable by the glasses of his round glasses silhouette. And funnily enough, one of the Millennium Group members that you see in silhouette, Joe Harris, has him as wearing round glasses.
Right.
You can put the pieces together. If somebody like yourself, who is not a raving, frothing fanboy like me, you just look at it and go, oh, shadowy figures, dark and grim. 1993 is the firm. Love it.
Yeah, but if you know, you know. Yeah, it does a good job of balancing it. But what about the central mystery then with the Millennium Group? Because obviously I know a bit about the Millennium Group, but I'm not uber versed into it. And I sort of got the gist of it. But do you think that all comes together cohesively?
I do, and I think it's interesting for your take as kind of somebody that's relatively walked back into the franchise and the extended universe again. For yourself, what's in the pilot? The Millennium Group in that pilot, Chris Carter very much introduces as a mirror of the real-life Academy Group, who are a group of former FBI agents and profilers who assist with the current administration in catching heinous killers. Now, we fast forward to the end of season 3 and Joe Harris' 5-issue comic.
Yeah.
We've got the Millennium Group in season 1 is then revealed to be an apocalyptic cult bent on the end times that in one episode of season 2 are attempting to find partially the cross of Jesus' fucking crucifixion. And by the 3rd season, they've become this shadowy cable nestled within the corridors of power and have infiltrated the FBI. So we've got very much a marriage of those two principles. We pick up in 2015. The Millennium Group Joe Harris depicts has continued that they're infiltrated law enforcement and law agencies and almost that culture at almost every level. So perhaps not unlike the certain morally dubious and shadowy figures of the current Trump administration, so to speak, just to take a random analogy out of the air.
So what about Frank's daughter's brought back in this?
Yeah.
So what does it do to their relationship? Because she's part of the Millennium Group at this point.
And it's interesting. I mean, we touched upon how she's estranged from her father, holds him responsible for the death of their mother, Catherine, in the 2nd season finale. Jordan, in the intervening years, hers in the original season is very much a childhood cipher. She represents the purity, the innocence, the hope. Chris Carter, one of the famous phrases of Millennium is in the opening titles is that he says, "Who cares?" The answer is Frank Black cares. Frank Black wants an idealistic, he wants a better world for himself, for his family. He wants to create this fortress, this magical yellow house that's a oasis of serenity and calm away from the evils of the world. He wants to protect Jordan. Jordan, through a period of estrangement from her father, has come to represent him as a flawed human being that impacts almost that he failed at that task. And she's allowed herself to become seduced by the imagery and the seductive, almost like Eden snake-like nature of the Millennium Group. It's ironic when you consider their symbol of the Ouroboros. Jordan represents very much a fallen ideal. She is somebody who Frank strove to protect her purity and her innocence. He sacrificed everything to make sure his family was safe. The tragedy is that Jordan now considers his actions to have been the very actions that caused their family's undoing. So it's a heartbreaking point when we begin this series and we realize that Jordan has aligned herself with the Millennium group. It also provides one of the most poignant moments in the entire run where those two characters are coming back together. And in a particularly shocking moment for myself, watching the stoic, unflappable, calm nature of Frank, he slaps his daughter because she blames him. He says, you are to blame for Catherine's death. You offensively played a part killing my mother. And Frank, as portrayed by Joe Harris's writing this, is a mixture of both horrified, appalled, and heartbroken. This.
Yeah.
It has come to this. And I think that's really the low tone for both of their characters. And the rest of the story is effectively a Joseph Campbell-esque heart of darkness as we rediscover that eternal bond and we rediscover what made Frank and Jordan such a potent and dynamic team in the original run. Towards the very end of season 3, it's hinted that Jordan experiences a gift, if not to say more powerful than her father. Joe Harris takes that idea, he runs with that idea, and in fact, that is my central unifying nature of the finale. But I'm getting ahead of myself.
So where does this leave the character of Frank, his daughter, and the Millennium group?
So Frank was beset by a variety of evil foes throughout the 3 seasons of the show. One of the most fascinating ways of looking at the very disparate natures of each season is they attempted retrospectively, at least in the fan consciousness, to unify the evils that Frank faced into a collective being entitled Legion. Now, Legion is only mentioned once by a character in the Judge in an episode of the first season. It has, as with most seasons in Millennium, a biblical allegorical state and origin. Legion is supposed to be a name given to a multifaceted manifestation of evil in its purest form.
Yeah.
It seems to be a nature and a force that emerges every millennium, that tries to get foothold in society and in the hearts and minds of humans and humanity. As with all things in life, there is nothing more frightening, although the X-Files would have you think liberated mutants at fruit grinds doing similar, slightly more scary. But I would agree with the statement that there's nothing more frightening than the evil within us itself.
Yeah.
That we are capable of as human beings. Legion is the antagonist of this story, perhaps even more than the Millennium group. It wants to draw apart the end times. It wants to cause chaos. It wants to cause despair. It wants to enclose fractions. It wants to enclose fractious nature and hatred in divisions of society. It very much, to be honest with you, Donald Trump and Mike Pence could probably be agents of Legion if we were to be doing a version of Millennium today. But Legion is hell-bent on establishing itself and getting a foothold in the world. Now, Frank knows Legion. Frank has faced Legion in its many forms over the series and over this comic, most notably in a seductive female guise called Lucy Butler, which is quite an original name if you consider the biblical origins of that. Lucy was a seductive femme fatale in the original series, as portrayed wonderfully by the actress Sarah Jane Redmond. And she appears intermittently over the 3 seasons of the show to bedevil, if you pardon the pun, Frank, and try and distract him from his mission and lure him to the side of evil. Legion and Lucy reappear in this 5-episode miniseries. They are determined to draw Jordan to their side. They are vengeful towards Frank for the efforts he's made to thwart them over the previous 15 years of previous into the show and in this current. And they also almost managed to kill Special Agent Fox Mulder.
That would have been a shock if that's where we go.
Absolutely. That's what happens when Gillian Anderson wears a G-spot on her excited.
Does it feel true to the show and where you think you would find the characters today?
Yeah, I think that Harris had a really difficult job because, I said that he had to reintroduce Millennium to a new audience that had watched the original run of the X-Files, that may have followed the X-Files in its relaunch in season 10, that might have seen Frank's reintroduction in Immaculate, and he had to introduce a whole shared universe here. So I think it was an absolute necessity to anchor Mulder in this story.
Yeah.
Because he is a centralized force to gently bring Frank Black's world and marry it with the milieu of what we were doing contemporaneously in the X-Files universe at that time. Do I think it succeeded? Yes. Do I think the story was, by its very nature, somewhat fan-heavy and continuity-heavy? Yes, but I think that they were skewering towards the fact that this would probably be a very niche product. It may sell less than the X-Files season 10. It may only have a more limited appeal, but those fans that campaigned for the return of Millennium over nearly 2 decades at that point, were clamoring for the return of Frank in some form. And there were various efforts made to bring the franchise back. We touch upon it, but the second X-Files movie in 2008, I Want to Believe, is very much, in my opinion, I don't know if you've seen it, you may well, is very much a Millennium story. It's about a serial killer. It's about mutilation of the dead. And, a paedophile priest played weirdly but wonderfully by Billy Connolly. It's very much a millennialistic story. So I think that attempting to bring that brand back, I think Joe Harris's 5-episode Millennium is very much an antecedent of the themes of I Want to Believe. That it draws upon that, and it says, this is a shared universe. It's a hell of a lot of mythology, and you need to draw people like yourself in that are going to be able to appreciate this as a folder and a story on its own merits, rather than feeling you're being absolutely suffocated under the weight of a franchise that you don't know.
Yeah, absolutely, and it does that very well. There's a sort of unique visual style to the TV show Millennium, or at least the stuff I've seen of it. The artwork here, is it evocative of that, or is it trying to do something different?
So, I mean, as you know, and as listeners from your sister podcast, your own extended universe enough. So I come from an artistic background myself. I love, my style is photorealism. I draw photorealism. Paranormals is not obsessed with photorealism.
No.
But what it does wonderfully and evocatively is it attempts to recreate the mood and the visual color of Millennium. It does this, I think, fabulously, because it has that sort of monochromatic, rain-soaked, nihilistic, sepia view of the world that is so prevalent in the original run of the show.
Yeah.
And whereas the X-Files, as a format, we can have an episode about serials, because next week, Dylan, we might have a livery to mutant. The week after that, we might be able to turn back time in a groundhog prostitution bank robbery. Millennium doesn't have that. It's much more of a cloned show. In many ways, it's much more of a traditional show, which is ironic considering how broad it wandered from its original premise of serial killer of the week, as it was originally, and perhaps unfairly said in the trade press. But I think that Lorimer manages to capture what is essentially 3 different shows branded under one show's title. And with a trinity of formats that you are attempting to unify, tie in a bow, and say, we hope this story may continue. We suspect that it probably won't, because it's a niche audience. It's a love letter to the fans. It has kisses to the past for it, but I think it attempts to not only provide a full stop, but give you an element of what I think was vital in Millennium, which is that imported to even the darkest of worlds and the darkest of circumstances, there is always hope.
Yeah.
And I think that's essential when you're doing a format as dark and cynical as this is. I think that, there's a reason that in the original show, Frank's ideal dream house was painted bright and airy yellow.
Yeah.
It is a big hope.
Yeah, absolutely. I like the grainy mutedness of the visuals. It suits the show. But then there's occasional sort of visceral pops of red and things like that work really, really well.
Frank's vision, what we spoke about, with the massive kind of flourishes of colour and devil red and apocalyptic imagery. But we are seeing that, and towards the end of it, we've seen the action returns to the Black family's long dilapidated family home, which is once again been painted yellow. And in fact, that is where the climatic denouement takes place, with Agent Mulder, Frank Black, Jordan Black, and Legis.
Yeah.
So I think that, absolutely, you've hit the nail on the head there. And it makes me tremendously happy for you as a casual reader to have grasped that this is effectively we are vanquishing the forces of an ancient evil. Probably, as we know, will never really truly die.
Yeah.
But we are doing it. And the fact that we can do that we have done that, and that we've unified a father and a daughter to do that, tells me that we've got an element of hope.
Yeah.
Who cares? Frank Black does.
Is there much more you want to say on this?
No, I think that it is a niche product. I think that it is, as a fan of the X-Files, you could easily parachute into this contemporaneous with the ongoing comics in season 10.
Yeah.
I think you could appreciate it just purely from Mulder's involvement. I think it's been very cleverly and intricately crafted to allow a casual reader to come into that world. However, I think that if you were to track down the original series of Millennium, and fuck me, that's hard to do for reasons that we'll get into later, I think it's wonderfully rewarding. And I think until, hopefully, we see the adventures of Frank return, for me, it's a wonderful epilogue to Frank and Jordan Black's story.
Amazing. So is it a clanger, a banger, or an average meander?
Well, Legion, sorry to say, you can go fuck yourself. It's a clanger.
A clanger?
No, it's a banger. Of course it's a banger.
Excellent. I really enjoyed it. I'm going to go average meander. There's nothing wrong with it, but it's not in that upper echelon of tie-in comic that I've experienced, and I perhaps would have got more from it and heard more towards the banger.
Had you been more invested
but it is accessible, it's an enjoyable read, and like colour me intrigued with Millennium in general because of this and because of the show itself.
Well, if you manage to track down decent coverage, then please let me know, because and if it keeps going the way like this, you're gonna have to borrow my box. They're timestamped. I want those ones back.
So there's not a huge amount of expanded universe for Millennium, but what there is a brilliant documentary called Millennium After the Millennium, although I believe it's had a couple of different titles and different versions.
Iteration is just After the Millennium.
After the Millennium.
It's factually correct.
Yeah, absolutely. Which was originally released March 22nd, 2019, directed and produced by Jason D. Morris, written by Joseph Madry, and produced by Shoni Elise Cook, Troy Foreman, and Joseph Madry. There weren't a huge amount of like science fiction documentaries or anything like that, so there isn't really anything we can talk about as that they kept contemporaneous to the time, except it was a time of big franchises. Nostalgia was in, so everything, there was new Star Wars films, new Terminator films, endless bits of Star Trek, all these things. So perhaps it was a good time for somebody to come along and basically revisit the world of Millennium and sort of do a retrospective of it. So this was the thing, actually, before we even talked about the comic, I think that you wanted to cover.
Yes.
So why was this?
So to give listeners some context to this, when Millennium was cast in 1999, ironically, let's say, for the actual Millennium, it garnered a very smaller but very devoted fan base. And several of those core foremost scholars and aficionados of the brand were, in many ways, industry professionals themselves. And in the 2000, 2007, 2008, a campaign was born entitled Back to Frank Black. And it was a brainchild of a wonderful gentleman called James McLean and Troy L. Fornham, who came aboard. And this campaign was primarily concerned with bringing the world of Millennium back in some form or another to the cultural sphere again. The end result would have been, the dream result would have been the return of Millennium as an ongoing television series. Realised that would be a tall order. So throughout the years of the campaign, they set themselves small goals, which would be immeasurable to achieve and keep the show in the public consciousness. They started the Millennium Group Sessions podcast, devoted with their attempts to keep Millennium in the public eye, bring the show back. It garnered the attention of executives at 20th Century Fox, as it was there. It was probably instrumental in keeping the show alive in the media sphere enough to warrant bringing the Millennium back as the IDW 5-episode miniseries of 2015. But in the interregnum between there, Troy and James did many things. They managed to get Chris Carter on the show to interview the creator and producer Millennium. Lance Henriksen himself, Frank Black.
Amazing.
Next up there. And small goals like this every year to keep the show alive. Now, Troy and Jason Troy James wanted to originally produce a Millennium comic themselves.
Oh, nice.
However, through various ideas and various interventions of fate, reality, they decided that this wouldn't be the best route to go upon. And it was Troy's innovative idea that he said he wanted to do a documentary, and thus Millennium After the Millennium was born.
Amazing. You've obviously seen this before. I'm watching it for the first time. How do you think it handles the show's history?
I think one of the things that really struck me about Millennium After the Millennium is that they wanted, and this is a core phrase, my interpretation of it, although it's a documentary for fans of Millennium, it does not come across as a fan documentary.
Yeah.
Foreman, Jason Miller, the claim, and the people associated with it are, in large part, industry adjacent or industry professionals.
Yeah.
They look at their subject matter with a detached eye that allows the casual viewer to come in and appreciate Millennium as a core piece of pop culture history, adjacent to the tremendous global worldwide success of its system, the X-Files.
Yeah.
That allows the viewer an in to enjoy the product and appreciate the story and the history of Millennium as presented in the documentary, and what cultural importance this particular part of the Chris Carter's work universe has on fans, fandom, and the general audience.
I think it does a great job at that, because there are different types of documentary you get within popular culture, and especially within geekdom. There are the very niche ones that are often DVD extras, and they're fine to be, we're talking about a very particular subject matter because it's for X amount of people who are going to buy it, and nobody who is not a fan is going to dip into it. But this needs to have a broader appeal. And a good documentary maker will find the story in anything, can make it interesting for you as a big fan, me as a novice, and somebody else who doesn't give a fuck about it, and will ultimately make you intrigue, care, and tell a story. Like, there was a documentary about boy bands recently. Brilliant documentary. I don't care about boy bands, but because you find the story,
personally invested in the story. I'm a big fan of documentaries as a general rule of thumb, and I'm talking about a range of things as esoteric, elliptical as looking at Jonathan Frakes' Unsolved Mysteries as light, fluffy, like Glasgow's Strange But True, to the other end of the spectrum, to watching a true crime series like the wonderful Netflix examination of the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, to ground up the reality, and then to kind of look at it, it's a bit more pop culture adjacent. The 5-episode series they did on the story of Vince McMahon, the story of the WWE promoter and his fall from grace. So I'm a big fan of documentaries per se.
As a sort of sidestep there, my partner has no interest in wrestling, but she loves a wrestling documentary because she likes the world around it more than the actual thing. So she'll sit and watch Dark Side of the Ring, the Vince McMahon thing, or WWE Unreal. But if I ever said, do you want to watch SmackDown? She's like, no, exactly. So that's a testament to them as good documentary makers.
A good documentarian. And I definitely class Mr. Miller and Mr. Foreman as good documentarian. They've managed to find the everyman relatable story in the history of Millennium and extrapolate that to a modern, accessible audience. This was a show born out of global success, the runaway train success story of the X-Files. It was a show that 20th Century Fox allowed Chris Carter unprecedented creative latitude to come up with whatever he wanted. Chris Carter was obsessed with coming up with true crime, was coming up with the nature of evil, the nature of what is evil, and exaggeration. Where do we get that? How do we look at that? How do we look at those uncomfortable corners of ourselves? That's become very trendy in recent years with things like Blind Fellas Cannibal. Even on Netflix now, it's a proliferation of real-life crime documentary podcasts. I love a real crime podcast. It wasn't in 1996. It began as a success story, and then through the success of its sister show and real-life financial, production, creative, fiscal factors, it came to an ignominious conclusion before it should have done. And I think there's a real arc creative tragedy, and yet heroism in the determination of that wonderful branch of creative to keep the show going against adversity and against all odds. That's an underdog story. And I think the fact that it's not as well known as its sister show, and yet has so many parallels and creative similarities to it, makes it fascinating for an audience.
Absolutely. So does it give the right amount of detail for somebody like yourself versus, I don't know, say perhaps the more niche stuff that you seek out as a
I
fan?
found a lot to enjoy as a Millennium fan documentary. I think what Jason Miller and Troy Foreman did so wonderfully was that they managed to create winks and nods for those people who are familiar with the brand, obsessive about the brand. And those are two very different milieus of all. Lucy Butler, aka Sarah Jane Redford, the antagonist of the show, a demonic, monstrous, evil, devilish entity. Her interviews are conducted in a church. If you know the show, there's a wonderful kind of twisted malevolence in that. If you don't know the show, it's just a wonderful scene setting and great iconography. Looking at it from a production viewpoint like yourself, it's very slick, it's very polished. That sort of thing adds a sheath, and a gloss, and a competency to the finished product that I don't think the term quote-unquote fan documentary really affords it the respect and the honesty that it deserves.
The production values are broadcast standards, you know?
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
it's not a fan documentary in the sense that someone stuck a video camera in someone's face and asked them their favourite story.
It's not bidding at you.
And also, most notably, for an unlicensed fan documentary, by saying fan, I feel like I'm giving it a disservice. It's a bunch of professionals who are fans who want to tell a story. But it has licensed clips from the show in it to illustrate its points, which you would never see in so many fan documentaries. And that says that not only do they know what they're doing to be able to get these things licensed, but the copyright owners also go, okay, this is the sort of product that we are willing to license a clip for.
I think there's a lot to be said. You said it wonderfully there. I think there's a lot to be said with, you know, we're coming off at this point in the gestation of the documentary, a bunch of releasing 2018, 2019 as half of the millennium. These boys have been running the Back to Frank Black campaign for a decade before that point. You know, they've shown that they are creative. They're industry professionals who are fans of Millennium.
Yeah.
They're not fans of Millennium who have a bent for being industry professionals.
Yeah.
And I think that's a creative distinction that's worth noting. These people have got careers of their own, and they've got talents of their own, but yet their shared passion and honesty, humour and raw drive for this IP has garnered the respect of the show's cast and creators.
Yeah.
And I think that trust, I think that honesty, and I think that respect is not only borne out by the use of licensed material, but I think it's borne out by the level of honesty and truthfulness that comes out in the interviews that are conducted with the cast and crew. I think there's a tremendous awareness and acknowledgement to, praise the show's successes and where it was. But I think there's also a great amount of hubris in saying, you know, maybe we didn't play that right. Maybe we were a victim of circumstances.
Yeah.
In the case of Chris Carter, he actually admits in the documentary that his desire and sheer will to get Harsh Realm on the air at Fox Network the fall of 1999 was what greatly caused Chris Millennium's cancellation.
Yeah.
I think he is not only aware of that, but I think he's ashamed of that to an extent, in the sense that he feels that he robbed the fans of Millennium, the crew and cast of Millennium, without this appraisement they deserve. Is that any fault or blame to be put there? No, I think it was just a creative synergy and a willfulness and creation powerhouse at the time to want to do new things. I don't think there's any fault or blame to be assigned there. I just think it's an unfortunate side effect of the creative landscape at that time. And maybe it's a reflection of, you know, post the launch of Millennium, where Chris's attentions were split between the first season of Millennium, the fourth season of The X-Files, and a 2-hour feature film, that he thought, you know, I simply cannot divide myself like that again. I respect that.
Yeah. Does it capture all the key figures from the show's history?
99.9 infinity of people who were involved with Millennium are interviewed in this show and give their 2 pence of the show.
Yeah.
There are a couple of exceptions. From a purely personal perspective, one of the major players I find in Millennium is Glenn Morgan and James Wong, who came onto the show in the 2nd season after the cancellation of their own series, Space Above Beyond.
Mm-hmm.
They were invited on with James Wong and Glenn Morgan describe slightly sarcastically as a truckload of money to keep the show afloat for another year while Chris launched his attentions on the 5th season of The X-Files and the upcoming release of Fight the Future. They have, again, Chris gave them total creative carte blanche. And in that 2nd year, any initial reservations that people may have had about an overemphasis on serial killer of the week in the initial imagining of the show, as you will, the 2nd season is much more preoccupied with apocalyptic imagery. I touched on it earlier. There's episodes that involve, and I won't ruin it for listeners too much, but a feral of dogs that form one of the harbingers of the apocalypse of the Millennium Group, a reclusive author investigating the cult of self-officy. I wonder what that's a parody of. And 4 demons in a coffee shop having a coffee and discussing Frank Black over donuts.
My favourite episode that I've seen of Millennium so far, and I said I've only dipped in a bit, was that particular episode.
What was it that attracted you about that particular episode?
It's one of the most bizarre, wonderfully bizarre, darkly humorous, gripping bits of television I've ever seen. It's like, if I had to do a top 10 of just episodes of a different TV series that I was like, this is pushing not only the format of its own show, but the format of television forward, I'd be like, that is, and it's, it's a portmanteau sort of story, but just done with such a late 90s version of it that I was just like, wow, this is good shit.
I mean, that particular episode was 2 episodes before the effective end of the world apocalypse that Morgan and Wong did at the end of season 2. I think it's a testament to Millennium's creative, broad church playing field, as it were, that you can have something as strange and elliptical and wonderful and opaque as that, and then have an episode that's more conventionally based on more serial killers. And I think that's part of the tragedy of Millennium, and that's what Troy Foreman and Jason Miller capture so wonderfully in After the Millennium, is that this was a show that, due to various production circumstances and changes in narrative arcs and production crews, effectively, yes, was a different show for each 3 seasons. But that's not to its detriment. That's actually a major plus point in that you've got something new and wonderful to enjoy each week when you watch it. And I think that sort of emphasis of change and the importance of unity and the broad themes of the show of hope against despair and good against evil, I think that is wonderfully brought out in the documentary, where the creative forces behind this do emphasize that this was a show that was, in many ways, a hard sell for the average viewer.
Yeah.
It was, I was intrigued when you told me your initial thoughts upon rediscovering the pilot. This is a very dark program.
It is. There's no escaping it.
But I think that it's so vital that beacon of hope, goodness, and that is personified by Mark Templeton Foster and Brittany Tiplady, a child actress of superlative who turns in a peerless performance as Jordan Black. And the documentary, it talks a lot.
There's a moment where Lance goes, oh, okay, so I've got this, within the documentary goes, so I've got the script and I'm saying to Chris, like, where's the lightness in this? And Chris says to him, it's the yellow house. And it's like, I think genre fans are often very dismissive of relationships as soapy elements, but that's more of a fault of older genre than a fault of newer genre incorporating relationships and real characters. But it is right there, like, there's this family at the core, and sure, it's a dysfunctional family, because one of them is, well, or potentially 2 of them are these sort of criminal psychics.
I concur that completely. I mean, I personally, this is only my opinion, I think that the pilot of Millennium is one of possibly the best hour of television Chris Carter wrote in the entirety of 1013 production. And I'm including all of this X-Files, its 2015 reboot, and including both feature films. I'm even including, God forsake it, Arch Rome, and the X-Files spin-off Long Dumb. And I think the pilot script of Millennium is superb in setting aside in 46 minutes the themes, the format, the characters, the emphasis, and the tonal balance and equilibrium of the universe it sets out to do. I think it's a wonderful piece of work. And one of my all-time favourite scenes, and again, this is actually utilised in the documentary, so shout out to the guys who chose this clip because it wonderfully embodies Millennium as a format for me. There's a scene in the pilot episode where Frank and Catherine, his wife, played by Megan Gallagher, are putting their daughter Jordan to sleep, and they're talking about the horrors of Frank's work and the fact. And she says, you know, you can build this fortress, you can build this yellow house, you can build, but Frank, you can't shut the real world out forever. Sooner or later, the evil and the darkness is going to seep in. And Lance Henriksen has a life, and he says, I want you to make believe that I can.
Yeah.
And that for me is the heart of this show.
Amazing.
And I think that what Troy formerly Jason Miller have done in Millennium After the Millennium is make the audience make believe that Millennium could have gone on forever. Because it was that strong an idea.
I do get that impression. Do you think there's goodwill towards the show, and does it feel special for the people who were involved in it?
I think so. I mean, I get the impression from the cast and crew that are interviewed, Lance, Megan Gallagher, Bill Smithcraven, Brittany Titlady, all the way down to creatives like executive producer Chip Johansson, executive producer Frank Thomas, Chris Carter himself. There seems to be an overwhelming affection and a unifying love for this show that was critically out there underappreciated. I don't think it got the love it deserved. And I think that there is a unifying sense that this was something special post-career. Perhaps in a sense that they didn't even realise to the extent of at the time. But the willingness for all of these eclectic array of critics, let's not forget, most of these people have gone on to stellar careers with their own shows, with their own productions, in their own branches of media, careers, jobs, work. But there's something about Millennium as a concept, a format, an idea, a seed that just speaks to them. And it makes them fondly remember their time on that show. And I think that love, and that, I'm going to use the word nostalgia, although I hate it as a concept. I think the word that love and that nostalgia for that time is so wonderfully evoked that I think that passion for that project translates off the screen.
It's a different sort of nostalgia, though, if you're involved in it, to the sort of nostalgia farming that we get in terms of IP that,
I think in
these
2026
days.
it's become, we're looking at, I think we're looking at a vastly different TV landscape now. Yeah, you get things like straight affairs that are breakout successes, but most things on streaming, 2 seasons maybe, 2, 3 seasons.
Over 5 or 6 years.
Over 5 or 6 years. There's a long, short season orders. It's a lot harder to get something made.
Yeah.
I believe that a pitch document, something like Millennium, I genuinely don't think was get in on television in 2026. I think it would be viewed as too dark, too niche, too secular for one particular section of the audience. There was something very magical about that time. Something as epoch and genre defining as this was on network television on a Friday night as one of the core 4 networks in America. Well, and I think that's what the documentarians really get across beautifully here, is that this was creative synergy of circumstance and finance at the time that allowed them the latitude to really do something quite special. And I think a lot of the creative forces in the show realized that really was something unlike anything they may have done elsewhere in their career.
Yeah.
I mean, fucking hell, Lance Henriksen has been in 2 of the major franchises of cult sci-fi, Aliens and the Terminator.
Yeah.
And yet, when people go and see Lance conventions, and I can attest to this because I myself, I mean, as much as I come out in a terrible heinous rash if I have to go to convention for more than 38 seconds, fucking I made a special effort to go and meet Lance Henriksen because it wasn't because of Bishop, and it wasn't because of the Terminator, because of what he did as Frank Black, and what Millennium did as a program. There's something very special about that show, and I think that's what's really captured in this documentary beautifully.
Do you get the impression from the documentary that it was a tough show to make?
Oh, 100%. I think that this was a show that really changed irrevocably over the course of its 3 years. And I think the fact that it is so hugely different in each of its 3 incarnations is a visual on-screen embodiment of that production upheaval. I think in many ways it was born out of the success of the X-Files, and I think in some ways it suffered production-wise as a result of the success of the X-Files.
Yeah.
Because the production landscape in 1998, 1999 didn't allow the sheer depth and creative synergy of somebody like Chris Carter, who wants to give 110% to each hour of television he produces. That's fine if you're in 2026 and you're the Duffer Brothers and you're doing 8 episodes made over 5 years. Chris Carter was doing 24 episodes of each show a year.
Yeah.
It was just a nature of, I think, sometimes, what are we getting out? You know, what are we shooting next week? And I think to kind of maintain that huge creative threshold, that standard of quality that they did amongst and against adversity, I think speaks to the passion of those people involved with the show.
There's loads of interesting anecdotes and quotables in this documentary, but I don't want to spoil them for people who haven't seen it. I want them to go out there and discover the documentary for themselves. Whether you are a fan or not a fan, or a casual view or whatever.
I know that this documentary did a festival circuit.
And I can see why it would do well there.
It did SXSW, it Telluride, you know, it did the circuit, and it did very well at the circuit. You know, you'll see the creative critical audits heaped upon.
Quite rightly so.
Because, and I'm not going to sell it short here, it does introduce the concept. It's not at its heart a niche fan product. It's about a group of creative people who came together to produce something very special, and through adversity, managed to create something which has created a hugely strong, albeit smaller fan base than its sister show, that has endured nearly 30 years after its original broadcast. And I think there's an element of heroism, and I think there's an element of hope. I keep turning to that word in that story that can appeal to anybody, even a non-fan.
Indeed.
If they exist.
As I said, it's a brilliant documentary. People should go out there and check it out. Is there anything else you want to say on the documentary?
I think it sits as a wonderful adjacent to the show. I don't think you need to be a huge fan of Millennium. I think it helps if you are. But I think you can just come in and appreciate this at a production level of a well-made, richly told story of a very particular time in the filmmaking industry of Hollywood in the late 1990s. And as much as Millennium is actually about sense of existential societal dread and angst as we approach an era of unprecedented change, I think that the documentary captures that this was a time of change, uncertainty, and risk-taking in the entertainment industry as a whole, as in Los Angeles and Hollywood in particular. I think it gave birth to something strange, undefinable, and magical, and I don't think perhaps we may never see the likes of again. And there is a reason that one of the key phrases of Millennium is repeated in this documentary is indeed, this is who we are. This is who Millennium is. This is what we were. And I would urge listeners to seek it out. I think it's great introduction.
It is. And I also think there are certain key shows that, even if they're not the biggest show in the world, are able to capture the pop culture and television landscape at the time. And this documentary does well to chronicle that. So when you're telling the history of American television, Millennium may not be a big point on it, but if you're looking for a case study of an insight into what making shows at that time was like, this documentary is that perfect from a sort of an academic point of view, almost. Not to get too sort of fancy about it.
No, we're not going to be aiding professors.
No, but if you are if you're somebody doing a degree on the history of television, the history of American television, and you want an insight into what it's like making a show at that point, you could do a lot worse than this documentary to sort of give you the highs and the lows and what the day-to-day sort of production cycle is like.
The X-Files. I think American television was driven upon the idea that a committee of writers and a writer's room was the way to birth in Genesis along on its series. I think that previously to Chris Carter, probably the only antecedent to him before that would have been Stephen Blatchoff on Hill Street Blues. But I think American television realized with the birth of the X-Files in September 1993 that a single driven creator at the helm was the best way to birth a unique idea, a series. I think Chris Carter in a massive way. I think the X-File in a major way. And I think Millennium in a integral but smaller way, I think changed American television. And I think that's what gave birth to Vince Gilligan's Breaking Bad. I think it's what gave birth to things like the Duffer Brothers on Stranger Things. I think it's what gave birth to Ryan Fuller on Hannibal. All of those things and many more owe Millennium a huge debt for the role that it played within the creative oeuvre of American television at the tail end of the 20th century.
Amazing. So this documentary, is it a clanger, a banger, or an average meander?
Well, you know what? This is who we are, and this is how we bang.
It's a banger from me too. Brilliantly put together documentary. You could show this to someone who doesn't know what Millennium is. It's a good primer. And as I said, I'll be watching more Millennium as a result of this and the episodes that I've seen.
Hot for TV.
So Liam, we've discussed this. This has come up a few times during our chat. Why can't I find Millennium easily?
So Chris touches upon this in the documentary, but Millennium, unfortunately, is a victim of several factors. One of those factors being the fact that it never really achieved the crossover mainstream success of the X-Files. So retrospectively, as a grand property, may not have the capacity to translate well into streaming that perhaps its sister show did. Another thing that some of your listeners may know is that for syndication reasons, a show is usually hoped to get to 100 episodes to make it more of a sellable prospect around the world. Millennium only ever got to 67. So in many ways, it actually fell short of reaching the millennium where it may well otherwise achieve that. But the primary reason, and for our listeners who want to check out more on this, I would say just to check out Chris Carter's wonderful panel that he did at the 25th anniversary of Millennium at the Files Fest in 2025, is that Millennium contains, especially second season, an awful lot of use of pop music to tell a story. Now, not contemporaneous time, but more than one, to give one example, we're very much a fan of counterbalancing horror of certain scenarios, of the horrors of Frank's life, serial killers and graphic and gratuitous violence and imagery, and offsetting that to make it truly unset by putting A Room with No View, or Twilight Time, or Johnny Mathis's Wonderful, Wonderful. And the use of that licensed music has made it incredibly difficult for them to use and get that with the rights holders because it is so integral to the show and put that and stream it later on. So unfortunately, as a result of the hefty prices that would be incurred for that licensing of that music, it doesn't make it financially viable to have Millennium on stream.
That's such a shame. And also a shame that those things weren't licensed out for like a longer duration. And I guess because it's a niche show, there isn't like a team there that's going, oh, we could redub them with this generic song, or change this or change that. So that's such a shame.
It is, and I think it's an unfortunate consequence of the fact that in 2026, in a streaming landscape, factors like that are smaller roadblocks just mean that from a streamer's point of view, it makes it not financially expeditious to license it and put something like that out there.
Yeah.
Because it's financially not viable to. There's entire episodes that are named after Johnny Mathis's song, Goodbye Charlie, with no view. Unfortunately, it's a consequence of the fact that it is very much predicated on that cultural landscape at the time. And I think to siphon and remove that music would effectively take out a lot of Millennium soul.
Yeah.
So, it becomes a lost piece of television nostalgia, which I think is very unfair, and I think it deserves to be seen in equally high regard to defining industry movements such as Breaking Bad or The X-Files. But here we are.
Do you think there's life in the show? Do you think, be it as a reboot, a follow-up, comics, audios, whatever, like, is there anything there?
Realistically, 30 years on, I think the time may have passed. Do I think that there are creative avenues for alternative media, such as Big Finish, to take up the realm of telling Frank's story? Absolutely, I think it'd be wonderful. Do I think that having a property that's at least partly now owned by Disney is like that? No, I don't. But I think that it's a small consequence, and I think that we may see Frank return. I don't think it'll be an on-screen iteration. Do I think that, as I've just said, Big Finish or an equal audio adaptation could take up maybe potential? Do I think that the property has life in it? Absolutely. I suspect that were we to bring Millennium back now in any form, I suspect the story may well be that I've drawn on that. With Frank as a guest side character, integral to the narrative, but not the heart of the narrative.
Makes sense.
In many ways that we see that we're on the cusp, and I couldn't be more excited by Ryan Coogler's reimagining of the X-Files. It's coming early soon, at time of recording this particular episode. I think that there is tremendous mileage to be done in a similar reimagining of Millennium. Do I think that it's attractive as a process and a prospect for a investor? No. But I think that were somebody to take a risk on it, looks like the Fox Network did in the fall of '96, I think it would be its own reward. I really do.
I think it's the sort of thing that maybe 6 or 7 years ago, when they were mining all IP for what it's worth, there must have been a conversation somewhere about, can we get anything else out of this? But in the current landscape, I just can't see. It's not a big enough proposition, I don't think, which is a shame. But I think it's a good world to tell stories in, as you say, whether it's with Jordan or whether it's something a bit more niche, like a comic or something like that. I think there's more stories to be told there, but I don't know whether, with the best will in the world, there's a large enough sort of global willing for it to happen.
I mean, you touched upon it there, at the risk of kind of concluding our meanderings and musing on a slightly down the low. I think in a 2026 post-Trump, post-Epstein, post-factual lying landscape, we're now dealing with a world where fact has been, and truth has been deprioritized by political agents and agencies. I think we're now in a landscape where integrity and honesty times has proven to be considered to be a negative conflict. Now dealing in a world, without mentioning any names, where presidents can be named on international lists of various predatory people and yet still be in positions of power. I think in that world, in a negative, nihilistic and cynical world that always seems to be on the brink of some sort of global drama, I think a hero such as Frank Black would represent truth and honesty, integrity, and stoic heroism in the fight against evil forces. I think that sort of character is more important than ever. I think it's a vital story to tell. And I think just were somebody to take a risk on a brand like Millennium, they would find that it really triumphed in the 2026 world, which for me is part of the whole tragedy about why it's not given the the respect in television analysis history that it deserves.
Yeah, it's a shame. But look, it's been great to jump into the world of it today, comic-wise, documentary-wise, and the show itself. If people want to find you on the internet, where can they find you?
So I am primarily I'm on a few forums. I decided to dip my toes into the annals of social media, even at my advanced and decrepit age. As I mentioned to you before, I am primarily an artist who deals with photorealistic art and imagery. I have a bent towards IPs in the cult television and music genre. I also have a personal interest which translates into a professional predilection for wrestling, which I love,
Yeah.
the world of WWE and AEW. And you can find me on Instagram and TikTok as Artfully Liam. That's Artfully as in gratefully, and Liam as in the eponymous hero of Gene Roddenberry's Earth's Final Conflict. That's a story for another day.
Amazing. It's been a blast.
If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, as it helps people to find the pod. Look for Too Hot for TV on Instagram, TikTok and YouTube at Too Hot, 4 pod. That's Too Hot, 4 pod for the latest updates and additional content. Both me and Liam will be back next week, and we're going to be talking to Troy L. Foreman, one of the producers of the documentary After the Millennium.
But until then, I've been Dylan.
I have been Liam.
And this has been Too Hot for TV.
This is who we are.
Too hot for TV.